Yes, you're rolling.
Pravin Krishna, welcome to Carleton University. Great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you would share with the audience your recent research on trade and income inequality in India, Pravin.
Great. Thank you, Vivek. So I'm here to present this paper later today on trade and inequality in India. This is joint work with Guru Sethupathi, who's a colleague of mine at Johns Hopkins. So what we explore in this paper is the patterns in income inequality over time in India and how these have evolved, especially after the Indian reforms were undertaken beginning in the early 1990s. In terms of kind of how we got to this project, just as from a scholarly standpoint, we are all aware that economic reforms, international trade reforms in particular, could affect the distribution of income in society. And India, being that it has an abundance of unskilled labor, the general expectation, at least from kind of a simple theoretical standpoint, is that this unskilled labor will find greater reward once India opens up to the rest of the world, as it did in big ways in the early 90s. And that, in fact, if anything, we should expect income inequality to shrink as a consequence of that. On the other side of that, there is the other argument, which is kind of the economic geography argument, if you will, which is that it's possible that globalization or marketization of an economy, or greater marketization of an economy, will lead to certain agglomerations of economic activity. That economic activity concentrates itself in particular locations or in the hands of particular groups of people and so forth, and that what you have instead of kind of decreasing inequality is increasing inequality.
So this would be coming out of ideas that for instance, Paul Krugman has talked about.
That's exactly right. And so there's been kind of an enormous amount of policy interest, academic interest in this question of what actually happened. It's quite important for us to understand what the effect of the reforms were and kind of the distribution of income in India. And so what we wanted to do was to kind of dig up the data, look at what the patterns actually were and how they've evolved over time. And so that is what we've done in this paper, starting from looking essentially from about late 1980s until about 2005 or so, which is the latest round of data that we worked with.
And I understand from my reading of it that you employ a novel methodology in this paper, a new measure that hasn't been used. Maybe you can explain to the audience how is your measure of inequality different from the conventional Gini coefficient that we always read about?
That's right. So one of the things that when we started working on this project, we said, let's first take a look at what everybody else has done before us. And what we found in the literature was a variety of papers looking at very different measures of inequality. So you've got one paper talking about inequality across states using a particular inequality measure. A different paper looking at inequality across urban and rural areas using a different inequality measure. A third measure looking at inequality, say, across individuals within a rural area or within urban areas, and so forth. And the problem essentially is that these inequality measures don't aggregate up nicely, which sounds a bit technical, but the point is that if you wanted to say, what's the total inequality in India? Can we express it in particular, this kind of measure this total inequality is the sum of inequality across states and inequality within states.
And again, for the audience, the conventional Gini coefficient doesn't have that property. You can't add it together, basically.
That is exactly right. So it does not add up in a neat fashion. And because we're interested in these different questions of what was the pattern of inequality across states, what was the pattern of inequality within states, we said, let's start with an inequality measure that aggregates up neatly. And so that very quickly brings you to a particular family of inequality measures, and this is what we use, the tile measure of inequality.
Okay. And so do you want to share what your principal findings were in the paper?
Yeah, so our principal findings essentially are that we find, as some others have done, that in the immediate years following the reforms, that there was in fact an increase in inequality. And so as you look from kind of the early 1990s to the late 1990s, there's some kind of pattern of increased inequality. But as you get beyond that point and look at the most latest available data, which is 2000 on to 2005 or so, that what you have is actually a falling pattern of inequality. And so what we sort of find our bottom line here is that you don't have a kind of a straight line increase in inequality as there have been more reforms and greater opening up and greater liberalization across the board in different sectors and so forth. It's not as if you're seeing kind of a continuous increase in inequality, that you had this kind of initial increase followed by a reduction, which we see as being a good thing.
And in particular, in regard to the link or putative link between trade and inequality, you don't find really much of a correlation there.
That's right. So that's an important part of our analysis as well. What we look at is kind of cross-state correlations, measuring across states the exposure of states to international trade and the patterns of inequality in these states. And so we're looking to see if states that had greater trade exposure, for example, had greater increases in inequality, and we find that not to be the case. So changes in inequality generally are kind of uncorrelated with exposure to international trade, and that's the other kind of big result from
the paper. So
yes.
Trade, the way I read your paper, trade really is a footnote to the story of inequality.
That's correct.
At best.
That's a very good way of putting it, yes.
And I mean, just thinking about the interpretation, this is how I've been framing it in my New York Times piece that talks about your research, among others. That, I mean, depending on one's point of view, where you're starting from, one could read your paper in quite different ways.
Okay.
In other words, if someone is of the belief that international trade, in some sense, has been good for inequality, hasn't been bad for inequality or for poverty,
right.
but you don't deal with poverty, they would find some support in your paper.
Right.
At least there isn't a negative result.
That's right.
In some sense, for that optimistic view. But on the other hand, someone who says, well, the mechanisms that trade theory points to don't
right.
seem to be working. We don't see this relationship play out the way that one would expect between, say, between greater freer trade or greater liberalization and an effect on wages of unskilled workers, let's say, or inequality. So what, I mean, just sort of stepping back and looking at it more broadly as a trade economist, how would you interpret your findings in that sense? That's
right. So on the one hand, we see there's a clear kind of theoretical argument that this is how trade ought to work, that these are the mechanisms of international trade, and the very same mechanisms that give us the gains from trade should also be resulting in a decreased inequality, increased returns to unskilled labor, and so forth. And the fact that we haven't seen so much of that might cause you to question whether trade was effective in any way at all in terms of transforming the economy. In the Indian case, I don't quite see the Indian kind of economic context fitting very tightly or narrowly kind of the assumptions of the theory that give us this type of prediction about inequality. So for example, a highly monopolized import competing sector in which when you introduce international trade, there's kind of a compression, great increases in competition, greater varieties that are available to consumers and so forth. So a variety of mechanisms through which international trade could be benefiting and has benefited, I believe, the Indian economy that don't fit into kind of the traditional theoretical structure that gives us these particular predictions about inequality. So it's an interesting question, and you're a contributor as well to this literature. One of the early contributors, I think.
I was going to say almost 20 years ago now.
That's right.
And the debates, in a way, haven't changed. I mean, 20 years ago, Bhagwati and I were writing about the U.S. and has trade liberalization worsened inequality, particularly for unskilled workers. And
that's right.
I mean, in a sense, America is having that debate again now as it gears up for an election.
That's right. And as you know, one of the kind of confounding factors there is technological change and kind of skill-biased technological change, and of the sort that you've also seen in India, I believe. Technology upgrading and so forth in factories and important competing sectors.
Now, this isn't part of your paper, but maybe you can just speculate a bit. Do you think the technology potentially has played a big role in the case of India? I mean, you suggest that.
There's certainly certain sectors where clearly it has. So if you look at the service sector, if you look even on kind of a tradable margin, things like the software industry and so forth, it's all about technology and the ability of technology to kind of generated opportunities that Indian entrepreneurs and engineers and so forth have done kind of remarkably well taking advantage of. So that much is very clear. In other areas, if you say what's the technology that's being used to produce an automobile or a scooter, I think it's clear there as well that there's been technology upgrading. Now, what were the mechanisms that caused this upgrading? Was it international trade? Was it domestic liberalization?
Foreign investment.
Foreign investment. These are interesting questions, and
Yeah.
I don't think I have a very clear answer to that. But has there been significant technological change since the early 90s until now? I think
Clearly there has.
Clearly there has.
Another thing that comes to mind in thinking about the Indian case is the fact that labor laws are still very rigid.
That's right.
And so perhaps that's one, just again speculating, one reason why one doesn't see the impact on the wages of unskilled workers as much, because there isn't the sort of the supply response. There isn't the response in terms of hiring a lot of unskilled workers.
That's a very good point. And as we kind of look ahead to see in which directions the Indian economy might go, or in which direction policymakers might take the Indian economic system, clearly kind of labor market rigidities and kind of the labor laws are probably at the top or very close to the top of anybody's wish list.
That's actually a perfect segue to a second question I wanted to ask you, which is, as an observer of India, someone who writes on India, and from your position in Washington at Johns Hopkins at SAIS, what do you see as perhaps the most pressing economic policy challenges? You mentioned labor law reform. Are there others that you would flag as perhaps the most important ones that policymakers and analysts like ourselves have to look at?
It was hard to come up with a kind of a very clear list in the sense of, very clear ordering of which is more important, which is less important. But among the more important things, I would certainly say labor laws, free entry, free exit of firms, liberalization of that sort, the improvements in the legal system, some degree of certainty of outcomes that can be achieved for investors, entrepreneurs, as to once you make an investment, what exactly is going to happen after that. So these are some. I mean, you could look practically in any direction in India and find room for improvement, possibly significant room for improvement. But in terms of what's at the top of the list, I think these would be among the things that I'd put there. Okay.
And in terms of labor law, again, for the audience who perhaps doesn't know the Indian system as well as you and I do, who experience it directly, what is the main issue? What's the main crux of the labor law issue as you see it?
I mean, I'm not completely on top of the details of some of this.
But just broadly.
The broad point is that you don't have an ability to kind of lay off workers. And so if you don't have that ability, then
why would you hire them in the first place?
And so there's all these sorts of regulations that come in the way of the appropriate allocation of labor resources, the hiring, the scale of firms. Perhaps certain firms of a certain small scale are able to hire and fire workers more easily, and so this prevents firms from expanding to the point where there may be an optimal scale, because they worry that if they do so, they're not going to be able to sort of shut down operations or scale back in the face of decreased domestic or global demand and so forth. It's also true that, as a practical matter, that what happens is that because of regulations of this sort, is that firms rather than hiring workers on a formal basis, prefer to have an informal employment, and I have to imagine that this is not better for the worker. It's probably worse.
Worse for the worker,
yeah.
Because there certainly aren't the protections that a regular full-time employee would have.
That's correct. That's exactly right.
So in some sense, perhaps there is a typical Indian solution. There is flexibility at the margins.
That's right.
Not quite the way that the policymaker envisaged it when the labor laws were designed.
That's right. So you start off with a legislation that perhaps it made sense a long time ago, doesn't seem quite appropriate or perfectly appropriate for the moment, and you sort of see the kind of the dysfunction it creates in the system. And once in place, there's a variety of political economy forces that want to support the kind of the continuation of the policy,
of the
status quo, and it's hard to get rid of.
Maybe we can turn to a somewhat different topic of conversation since we have you here. There's been a great deal of discussion about the role of India as a potentially emerging power, as an emerging country, at greater prominence in the United States. Now, as someone who is a scholar at a leading policy school in Washington, I mean, what's the perception of India? Has the India story changed the way that it's being told in Washington?
I certainly think so. I think that over time, especially over the last 10 years. The combination of the two things, one is the economic strides and the impressive economic performance of India. That's certainly caught people's attention. The fact that it's all happened in the context of a stable, democratic political system, or which is a relatively stable democratic system, is also impressive. Alongside kind of these economic achievements, you have a political view, kind of in the post 9/11 world, where I think India is seen as a more stable, more mature, a better partner for the United States, for the West in a sense, shared values.
Democracy for one, an open society.
Open society. So these are things that in combination have been quite powerful, I think. And I think there's certainly a shift in perception. Significant influential voices in Washington and elsewhere arguing for closer relationship between the U.S. and India, and across the board, economic terms, political terms.
Cultural terms.
Absolutely.
Do you think that the Indian diaspora, people like yourselves who are prominent academics, bankers, consultants, do you think that's playing a role in changing the narrative?
Absolutely, and I think one can talk in general terms about kind of the impression that Americans have or the West has of Indians because of their achievements in various dimensions, whether it's kind of in the software sector, as kind of in academia or something else. But if one wanted to look for kind of specific context or specific achievements of the Indian diaspora, you could look at what happened towards kind of on the nuclear issue, where there was obviously an agreement that was being proposed between the U.S. and India, and it was very impressive what the Indian Americans managed to achieve in terms of political support in Washington at a time when Washington was actually bitterly divided in terms of Democrats versus Republicans. And they managed through their lobbying efforts and convincing of politicians in Washington that in fact this was a deal that made sense for everybody, and this was kind of in the long-term interest of the United States, and that they needed to put partisan differences aside.
And that was actually an extraordinary moment because it was sort of the dying days of the Bush presidency. A lame duck Congress,
that's right,
I believe, actually passed the legislation.
And with support across the board, across the two parties. Right.
And I think it's widely, as you suggest, I think realized now that the diaspora, in terms of pressuring or lobbying, cajoling members of Congress, played a big role in that.
That's very true. They had a significant role. They executed it very well. And in some sense, the question now for them is, now that the agreement is kind of behind us in a sense, it's what next? They don't seem to be, at least for the moment, major economic or political issues that they could kind of throw their weight behind or kind of generate some momentum for. And so kind of fallen back to less important issues in a sense, visa support for software engineers and so forth, all important issues in their own right. But without the kind of the scale in terms of kind of binding between the two countries, the bonding between the two countries of the nuclear deal. Yes.
So just sort of perhaps just to wrap up, looking ahead, looking forward, how do you see the changing contours of the Indo-US relationship? What if you were to sort of gaze into your crystal ball, what would you see as either looming potential economic challenges or areas where the two might cooperate?
I see a steady improvement. This is what I see. I think India has proven itself as a capable, and you increasingly hear these words, a mature,
partner
responsible
of
partner of the United States. I see the commercial linkages strengthening. In conversations I've had with kind of U.S. government officials, they will kind of consistently indicate their belief that the increased commercial ties are going to lead to better political links between the two countries. And in terms of just kind of the geopolitical strategy, geopolitical thinking, India is definitely seen as an important counterweight for the U.S. In the kind of the Asian context.
Vis-a-vis China, presumably.
Vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis other developments in the Middle East, Pakistan, Iran, and so forth. India itself, interestingly, does not want to be seen in that fashion. Okay? India would rather not be seen as a pawn in some geopolitical game, and sort of Indian officials consistently will reinforce that message. Having said which, I think it's all working out for the best, at least in terms of the relationship, and for India, that India is seen as a dependent, as a dependable friend and ally of the U.S., asserting its own independence and voice on issues in which it disagrees with the U.S., but yet in a kind of a reasonable, mature fashion.
Well, on that rather optimistic note, thank you for coming to Carleton today, Pravin, and thank you for sharing your insights on India, on international trade, and on Indo-US ties. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me. Pleasure to have been here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.